Not common, please.
How's your health?
Not common, please.
Good evening. I'm Sharon Ka. Tonight we're going to tell you a very complicated story. It's a detective story. It's a story of secret money transfers and of murder and of powerful influence. It begins with bits and pieces of discarded trash and ends in the offices of the Department of Justice and in your own weekly budget. The most important character in this story is Joe Bonanno Sr., a retired Tucson businessman who has a worldwide reputation as a member of the most powerful secret criminal organization, the Cosa Nostra. But Bonanno has never been prosecuted for his role in the Cosa Nostra. News Center 9 wanted to find out whether the Cosa Nostra is more than just a name, and whether Joe Bonanno Sr. did or still does play an important part in that organization. Our search took us to New York City and to Albany and to Montreal. But the most important documents were here in Tucson. They were notes in Joe Bonanno's own handwriting. The notes were picked out of Joe Bonanno's trash can during a 3.5-year investigation by the Arizona Narcotics Strike Force. A few of these notes have been used as part of court cases. A few phrases have been quoted in national magazines. But most of us have never gotten a glimpse of what the notes actually contained. Not until tonight. News Center 9 formed a special investigative team. I'm the reporter. G9 Frank is the photographer. And on our staff as a consultant for this story was Gene Amon, the former Strike Force agent who collected the notes. We located an administrative hearing in which the notes had been made a part of the public record. And so tonight, for the first time, you'll be seeing what stories they revealed, what the notes contain. It's a complicated story. It's fascinating, and it's important. Please stay with us. This story starts with trash, the leftovers of our lives that we crumple up and toss away with our grocery lists and broken cups. Both archaeologists and cops have always known that trash can be a great revealer. Think for a minute of what was in your trash the last time the garbage men picked it up. And think what a total stranger could learn about you from that random pile of rubbish. What company sends you bills, what you put down on your list of things to do, who left phone messages for you, who sends you letters. It's because of that, because of how much is revealed through the things that are thrown away, that Strike Force agent Gene Amon went to Pima County Attorney Dennis D. Concini in 1975 and asked for permission to begin collecting the trash of Joe Bonanno Sr. Once Bonanno had placed his garbage on the strip of public land between his sidewalk and the street, it was considered officially discarded. No one picking through the cans could have been accused of stealing. And so, on December 8, 1975, Gene Amon and a partner got themselves a van and went into the trash business.
It was a plain, unmarked van. And we drove in to the street where Bonanno lives on Sierra Vista.
They realized that if the trash cans in front of Bonanno's house were always empty, the real garbage men would begin to get suspicious. So, the first stop on their route was to pick up some other trash to put in Bonanno's trash cans.
We refined the process to where we'd drive down the street and pull in front of his house, pull the sliding door of the van open, reach down and pick up the can or cans, sometimes two, and pull it into the van. Take out the 2 or 3 trash sacks that he had placed into the can, put them inside the van, take our replacement sacks, put them back inside the van in those cans, put the lid back on, and put it back out on the curb. We got that process down to someplace between 25 and 45 seconds. We drove away in the van to a remote area, such as a parking lot at a grocery store. And we'd separate the real trash from the stuff we wanted to keep. We would find all of the standard kinds of things you would in trash: apple cores, coffee grounds, little pieces of information that exist about a person's life. But then we'd also spot those little pieces of paper that had been torn up and thrown away, and on those were the notes. And they would be 5 by 8 sheets of paper that had been torn into 10 or 15 pieces. We'd take all of those notes in their conglomerate pieces and stack them up into a stack and throw away the other garbage, looking inside all of the cans and all the little pieces, and then take these notes and go to another area, an office area that we had, and sit down and start putting the notes together. And we'd match up the writing just like a large jigsaw puzzle, match up the writing and the ink and put it into its original form and Scotch tape it. There were 15 or 20 different items on the notes, and they were such things as call Cigarro with a phone number, in fact 2 phone numbers. Another one that says call Pepe Fredo with a phone number. Joe had a propensity to use nicknames for almost everybody, his children, for his associates, for almost everybody. As an example, we found out that Pepe Fredo meant Cold Joe. Pepe is short for Giuseppe, which is Joseph, and Fredo means cold. This particular number, this 331 number, was listed to a Joseph Borsellino in Montreal.
So many of the notes involved phone calls made with quarters from payphones. From his early rise to power in New York, organizing payphones into a communications network had been a trademark of Bonanno's. He could make a call in a public place, like a hospital or an airport, and speak in any language without attracting attention, and more important, without anyone being able to put a wiretap on him. Law enforcement had known about the payphone network for decades, but for the first time, the notes spelled out for Eamon exactly how the system worked. Often, there would be a note, a reminder, for Bonanno to pick up more quarters.
Well, we'd find a note, for example, like this one, that says, Wednesday at about 5 p.m. at 622-9496. Pepe and Lino call me about money. And we found out that that phone number corresponded to a phone booth over at St. Mary's Hospital, as an example, or sometimes over at the University of Arizona Hospital facility, which was near his home. And we'd follow him over, or we'd try and pick up through the notes the time, and we'd meet him there and watch him go to the telephone booth. He would then take out a note, similar to this one as an example. It had a series of items on it that he wanted to discuss, and a one-way conversation would take place, wherein he would discuss things that appeared to be on those notes, and then he would take out his pen and he'd cross them off as he got through with them.
So, not only did the notes contain the names and the phone numbers and plans and documents that Eamon had expected to find, there was more. In the blurred pages of the notes, there were the clear, strong tracings of a very organized mind. And for the first time in all the decades law enforcement has been compiling information about Joe Bonanno, Gene Eamon was able to see, firsthand, unedited and undiluted, the record of how Bonanno's mind worked. For people in Tucson, who have lived as next-door neighbors to Joe Bonanno, who have seen his thoughtfulness, his charity, his courtesy, for those people, it is difficult to imagine why the strike force would have taken such an interest in Joe Bonanno's garbage. When you get away from the state, however, his reputation undergoes a sharp change.
So who was Joe Bonanno to the New York Organized Crime Task Force?
Bonanno was and is today the last, probably the last surviving founder of the modern American mafia.
Joe Bonanno is, by everyone's consent and everyone's assent, an organized crime figure.
In July '64, one of the great bosses of the New York Mafia, Joe Bonanno, was in Montreal.
He is the true mafioso, Don, the godfather, if you will, who outthinks his opposition before they outthink him.
Tom Renner is a journalist who testifies at congressional hearings because of his expertise in organized crime. Emerson Moran is a New York crime analyst. Ralph Smith prosecutes criminal cases in New York. Judge Denise Dion conducted the crime probe in Canada. And Dan Sweeney is the one who investigated Carmen Galente's murder. All of them have conducted investigations that include Joe Bonanno. And so in June of 1981, New Center 9's investigative team traveled to the East Coast to talk to these men.
That is no comment, please. Wish you the best luck. That is it.
How are you feeling?
No, come see, come ça.
Joseph Bonanno's story starts in 1905. He was born in a small town in Sicily.
Bonanno is from Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily, on the far western end, a very small town. The entire power of the mafia comes from Castellammare del Golfo. He enjoys a very unique status in that because he is an original member from that original town, which was the power influence after the Castellammare Wars in the very early 30s, that he is almost untouchable by his own group and by the groups from Sicily as well.
It's in this spot in North Brooklyn the very first traces of Joe Bonanno's life in this country begin, on 5th Street between Roebling and Driggs, because this was the site of old public school number 2, and this is where Joe went to school when he was about 6 years old. Bonanno's first day in America was a short one, though. His parents were called back to Sicily because of political problems there. The next time Bonanno came to this country, he jumped ship near Miami, Florida, and he entered the country at 17 as an illegal alien. By then he was an orphan. He had inherited some money, and he already had a strong commitment to a secret honored society in Sicily, the Mafia. As it was in Sicily, did the Mafia have the same character that we associated as having here in the United States?
No, in Sicily, several hundred years ago, the citizens of Sicily put together this protective association, which the Mafia was.
What happened to it as it sort of immigrated across the ocean to this country?
It became a good idea that became bad. When they came over here, they used the same mechanism that was the protective society to extort money and cheat their own citizens.
The place Joe Bonanno chose to settle down was Brooklyn. Even today, it's a city heavily textured by tradition.
All right, girls, all together now, looking at me. A nice big smile. Say, honey. Honey. Beautiful. Now, one more. Stay there. Don't move.
Within a decade, after a particularly bloody gang war in the 30s, New York was divided between the 5 most powerful men. Brooklyn was given to the youngest, 26-year-old Joe Bonanno. About that same time, 1941, Joe Bonanno got interested in the Grande Cheese Company in Wisconsin. Within 24 months, some members of Grande Cheese Corporation began to disappear. Thomas Nagalia was shot to death in a barber shop in 1943. The following year, Sam Gervasi was killed in a repair shop. James DeAngelon's body was found in the trunk of his wife's car. From then on, the Grande Cheese Company was believed to have ties to organized crime. Now, the cheese industry may not seem like a typical occupation for organized crime, especially compared to loan sharking or narcotics. But from the milk the farmers sell, to the factories that make the cheese, to the trucks that deliver the cheese to the mozzarella on your pizza, organized crime has touched the industry. The big cheese companies deliver their products all over the nation in trucks. That has some built-in advantages.
It's a route for narcotic smuggling. It's also a route to move aliens, and you collect, on both ends, you collect by transporting them, you collect by making them work, and later on you collect by using them as part of your organization.
Of course, when Joe Bonanno got into all of these businesses, he was an illegal alien himself. So on the advice of U.S. immigration, he crossed into Canada and entered the United States legally in 1938. By 1945, he had been formally admitted into this country. In the 50s, Bonanno's name showed up again in a legal document, Estes Kefauver's organized crime hearings. Back in Tucson, a bill was filed to cancel Bonanno's recently gained naturalization. He got a lot of support from the town he had made his home, however. Bishop Francis Green and politician Ivo DiConcini were just two of many prominent people who testified in his behalf. Judge James Walsh ruled that the U.S. government failed to prove its case against Bonanno. But in the very same year that Tucsonans were exonerating him, Canadians were keeping track of Bonanno's increasing influence in Montreal. The Canadian crime probe identified the families of Luigi Greco and Vic Catroni as the powerful organized crime forces in Montreal. The Canadian judge, Denise Dion, uncovered more references to Bonanno during his crime probe hearings in the mid-70s.
The evidence shown at the trial of Giuseppe Catroni in Montreal and of Carmine Galente in New York reveals that between 54 and 59, the Catroni-Greco group had transacted with a series of notorious mafiosi which belonged to the Vito Genovese, the Gaetano Lucchesi, and Joe Bonanno families. Relationships, transactions.
It was a paradox that Royal Canadian Mounted Police and even New York City Police were developing fact files on Bonanno's influence in organized crime. But that information was not used in the immigration hearings here in Tucson. Even then, Montreal had become an important town for Bonanno. He sent his underboss, Carmen Galante, to live in Montreal in 1953.
In the late 40s, early 50s, Galante organized Montreal. And it was a brutal, vicious organization. They burned places and they killed people indiscriminately.
Bonanno's oldest son, Salvatore, Bill, also made frequent trips to Montreal during the 50s, trips he's never been willing to talk much about.
Well, as I have said to grand juries, I was in Montreal to look after some business interest at that time that my father had up there.
Montreal police were, of course, interested in what those business interests might include. And in the 60s, they watched Bill Bonanno enter this restaurant to meet with some Canadians.
There was evidence given before our commission that on the 28th of November 1966, there was some police surveillance made here in the city of Montreal. On this occasion, policemen intercepted 2 cars in which they found Luigi Greco and 6 members of the Bonanno family, including Salvatore Bonanno, the son of Joe and one of his main advisors.
Joe Bonanno took a lot of out-of-town trips himself during the 50s. His passport shows that he went to Rome on September 13, 1957, and to Palermo, Tunisia, back to Palermo, and then to Rome and Paris. It is a coincidence that the Drug Enforcement Administration reports that that is the same route narcotics often took during those years. Would it have been possible for Carmine Galante, given his relationship to Joe Bonanno, to have set up the narcotics route from Italy through Canada and into the United States without Bonanno knowing about it?
No. Couldn't have done it without the permission, the guidance, and the supervision of Joe Bonanno. I don't think there's any doubt of that. I think that's, Joe Valachi used to say that. Bonanno never dealt directly with narcotics. He likes to stay above it. He's the prince.
In the United States, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had announced publicly that there was no such thing as the Mafia. But 1 month after Joe Bonanno returned from his trip to France and Italy, all of that changed. Mafia leaders had agreed to have a get-together with each other at the home of Joe Barbara in Appalachian. But before the meeting could get very far, police raided the place and people scattered. But in a cornfield nearby, police arrested Joe Bonanno along with a crowd of other people who admitted that they too had been at the meeting. 11 of the other people arrested were not only members of the Cosa Nostra, they were also involved in the cheese business. But once again, although Bonanno was arrested, he wasn't convicted. The 60s were not a good decade for Joe Bonanno. His troubles began with Senator Joe McClellan's organized crime hearings in 1963. Joe Valachi was called to the stand. He described his initiation into the Mafia with Joe Bonanno present.
He went on to explain that you lived by the gun and by the knife, and you died by the gun and by the knife.
Did you have a full understanding of what that meant at the time?
Yes, I did.
If there was any doubt in the minds of Americans that a secret criminal organization existed, Valachi erased that doubt. And soon a federal grand jury was asking for Bonanno. But Bonanno already had other problems.
Bonanno's biggest mistake came in the early 50s, mid-50s, when they decided, or 60s, when they decided, or when he decided that he was going to take over the New York family.
The commission was made up of the most powerful members of the Mafia, and it too sent word to Bonanno that they'd like to chat with him a bit. Bonanno ignored them. And at that remarkably convenient moment, with both the federal grand jury and the Cosa Nostra anxious to talk to Joe, he disappeared. He was kidnapped off the streets of New York. Mafia members talked about the incident amongst themselves, and the FBI listened in to some of the telephone conversations, especially those of Sam DeCavalcante.
Sam was having a discussion with one of Joe's primary lieutenants, Joe Ziccarelli, also known as Bayonne Joe. And it was in those discussions that they describe meetings which DeCavalcante attended of the commission, in which they discussed the plot that Bonanno had to murder Lucchese, Gambino, and Magaddino, how they were going to depose Joe Bonanno, and how they did depose him.
In spite of the simultaneous heat from the government and the Mafia, Bill Bonanno ran his father's crime family as well as he could during Joe Bonanno's mysterious absence.
Among the Sicilian people, the family unit is paramount. The family unit is a very, very closely knit structure, so that a violation or against one individual of family is tantamount to a violation against everyone in the family. So when in the early 60s, a member of my family, meaning my father, had difficulties with law enforcement and with others, there was no question in my mind what my obligations were. No one had to tell me what I had to do. It certainly is not the lifestyle that I would recommend to someone who wanted constant action, because contrary to what the public has come to know as organized crime and what Hollywood has done to prostitute that image, it's a life of really of gloom and of waiting. I mean, there are endless, between times of action, there are endless days, weeks, months of nothing but trying to do what you do, make a living.
During those years, Bill stayed at this house in Long Island. But on the streets of Brooklyn and in the Little Italy section of Manhattan, a shooting war broke out that finally became known as the Bonanno Wars.
It was a city that just simply had mountains of steel and concrete. And I found myself embroiled in a controversy much the same as what took place in the hills of Sicily over who stole whose chicken. You know, I mean, it really at times became nonsensical to me as to what the heck I was doing there.
This was the arguments over the mafia territory that you were involved in at that time?
Well, there was differences of opinion as to who should be where and who should do what to whom.
Mafia members were observed meeting at D'Angelo's restaurant. They agreed Joe Bonanno Sr. would have to be hit.
However, to do that, they would have to call in and get permission from the Sicilian Mafia, because he is a member of the Sicilian Mafia as well as Cosa Nostra. And they sat and discussed whether Joe Bonanno was going to get hit or not hit. And the decision was no. Bonanno survives.
2 years after Bonanno had been kidnapped, long after most people believed him to be dead, he showed up on the streets of New York. He was dressed precisely in the clothes he had worn the day of his kidnapping, and he simply walked into the Justice Building and turned himself in. Once again, nothing he said caused a conviction, and once again, it appeared as though Joe Bonanno had retired to Arizona. But even Tucson wasn't a refuge. One afternoon in the summer of 1968, a mysterious bomb blast shattered Bonanno's patio. It was part of a series of bombings that took place in Tucson that summer, and for a while, it appeared as though a gang war was about to erupt in Tucson. But in the end, the two people arrested in connection with the case weren't mafia figures at all. They were the contacts of the FBI agent who had been assigned to investigate the case. But even in the middle of all the problems of the 60s, Bonanno was expanding his interests in Canada. In fact, he even applied for Canadian citizenship, something that came to Judge Denise Dionne's attention during his crime probe.
In July 1964, one of the great bosses of the New York Mafia, Joe Bonanno, was in Montreal and tried to obtain authorization to come and live in Montreal on a permanent basis. To support his request, he filed a letter from Giuseppe Saputo, which offered to Bonanno to become a partner in his cheese factory business.
Bonanno was deported from Canada a few days later, and Saputo Cheese told authorities it dissolved its relationship with him. Saputo is Canada's largest distributor of cheese now, but it was a small mom-and-pop organization then. It had been invited to take a look at more modern facilities at Grande Cheese in Wisconsin, where one of the shareholders was Faye Bonanno, Joe's wife. Saputo Cheese made a remarkable rise to success after 1964. During the following years, Montreal police also continued to see Bonanno crime family members in their city.
In the month of February 1973, as they were testifying before our commission, two former police directors for Montreal, Mr. Plante and Mr. Fitzpatrick, confirmed the presence in Montreal in '54 of Carmine Galante and of Mike Consolo, and Malconsuelo. Two prominent members of the American Mafia, or Cosa Nostra, whatever you like. They came here to meet with Vincent Catroni and Luigi Greco, the bosses of the time in Montreal.
A couple of years later, the undercover trashman in Tucson found Galente's name on notes in the trash. It was at a time when Galente was making a bid for the leadership of the Bonanno family in New York. So Joe made notes to himself about things he should remember to tell Vestito, an important friend of his in New York.
Bonanno tells Vestito, put yourself at Lilo's disposal. Lilo is Carmine Lilo Galente. Trust him as you trust me. When Lilo says, you go ahead and contact Don Pepino, Joseph Bonanno, Don Pepino, you answer yes. You tell me what I have to do and I'll do it. In other words, again, Bonanno says to this man of his in New York, Vestito, you go to Galente, you tell him if he wants me to be contacted by you, you'll do it. You'll do anything he wants because he's mine and I'm yours and we're all working together.
It was a clear message from Bonanno. Galente was his choice to lead the Bonanno family. That note was retrieved in 1977. 3 years later, July 12, 1980, Carmen Galente was shot to death in a Brooklyn restaurant. Dan Sweeney was the New York policeman who investigated that murder.
Two young soldiers, as we call them today, came in, wanted to sit with Lilo. And more or less, they were called back there, and they sat in the back of a little patio-type arrangement. Provenzano leaves. About 5 minutes later, 5 gunmen came in, which time Lilo was killed, the bodyguard was killed, the owner was killed. The only 2 people that weren't killed in that whole backyard was the 2 soldiers that were there with them. We do believe they had something to do with the shooting, but something we can never prove.
Weren't both of them aliens from Castellamare?
Yes, both of them were
Which was the
aliens.
birthplace of Joe.
Joe. You don't hit somebody like Galente without Joe's approval. It's like Joe established him. It'd be like a slap in the face if another family came along and killed Galente without going back and at least telling Joe, this is what we want, this is what we feel should be done. It's disrespectful. Joe put him in, Joe will take him out. And this is what we felt happened. Joe was involved. Not directly, he gave the nod, he gave the approval, he allowed it to happen.
That was in 1980. That image is hard to reconcile with the one that Tucsonans have grown used to. A kindly, retired grandfather.
The man's still very active. He's very, very busy. And that can be demonstrated in the kinds of contacts that he made. He contacted a number of known, convicted, organized crime figures throughout the country. There were, for example, more than 24 specific references in his notes to contacting Frank Bompensiero, a man who spent felony time in jail and was murdered in 1977 at, in fact, a payphone booth that Bonanno used to call him at.
Crime expert Tom Renner believes that Bonanno remains influential in the cheese industry.
Joe Bonanno controls, through his investments and through the people he has dealt with over the years, an empire of cheese, Italian specialties that perhaps would total well over 100 million, if not more.
In light of all this, did Joe Bonanno retire?
No, he never retired. You never retire. There's only one way you retire from Cosa Nostra, that's feet first.
When organized crime gets mixed up with the cheese industry, it's bad news, according to the Pennsylvania Crime Commission. It started looking at cheese after a rash of arsons in pizza shops, a gangland-style murder of a pizza shop employee, and fraudulent business practices that caused severe economic harm to a Pennsylvania cheese producer. The commission published a report in March of 1980 in which it assessed the impact of organized crime's involvement in the cheese industry. The Crime Commission wanted to find out who was behind organized crime's influence in the industry. It said, the actual control of the cheese and pizza business begins with no less a figure than Joe Bonanno Sr. Bonanno, now living in Tucson, Arizona, is still regarded as one of the most powerful leaders of organized crime in America. Bonanno initiated a conspiracy to control the specialty cheese business in the United States in the early 1940s, and even today, he and his associates control the activities of the largest and most prosperous specialty cheese companies. One of the most recent events in the Joe Bonanno story took place here in Albany, New York. It's what should have been an absolutely routine administrative hearing before the Agricultural Board held in the Justice Building behind me. And it was a simple matter. Saputo Cheese of Montreal wanted a license to do business under the name of Utica Cheese in New York.
Under New York State law, to be a manufacturer, licensed manufacturer of cheese in New York State, one must be, among other things, of good character.
Ralph Smith was the last man the cheese company expected to be discussing mozzarella with. Smith is a criminal prosecutor. He was called into the case because just before the hearing, the Board of Agriculture learned that Joe Bonanno was alleged to have an interest in Saputo cheese.
There's never been a doubt but that Joe Bonanno was an organized crime figure and a very influential one. The fact that Saputo would be associated in business and apparently socially. There were some issues in this hearing about the social intercourse between the two. But his association with Bonanno, in our view and in the view of the hearing judge, was sufficient to establish his bad character and therefore met the test of denial of license in New York State.
Saputo was appalled at the turn a simple agricultural hearing was taking. But it was important to be licensed in New York because of import quotas. Saputo Cheese argued that there simply was no connection between them and Bonanno. They produced a list of stockholders and affidavits. Bonanno was on no official list. CPA Tom Fant worked for the state of New York. He analyzes financial records. And he had a slightly different version of that list, a version that Giuseppe Saputo always carried in his briefcase. In the briefcase version, Joe Borsellino's 20% share was rewritten as a 5% share for Borsellino and a 15% share for a Mr. J.B. Now, J.B. could refer to anybody, except that that same list, in Saputo's own handwriting, turned up one day in Joe Bonanno's trash. Other things were in the trash. At regular intervals, there were phone numbers that could be traced to Saputo's stockholders. And just to make sure that the strike force wasn't misinterpreting the notes, Gene Amon asked for a little help from Montreal.
We began to get the Royal Canadian Mounted Police involved to the extent that we asked them to try and get out to the phone booths when we believed that someone would be there to make a phone call or to receive a phone call and try and substantiate further evidence of the accuracy of the notes.
Once, they saw Joe Borsellino in a phone booth in Montreal at the very same time that the strike force was watching Joe Bonanno make that phone call from a booth here in Tucson. Again, it was in direct accord with the notes. Since the Saputos continued to insist that they had no relationship with Bonanno, hearing Judge Charles Breitel was mildly surprised that they didn't at least call witnesses to explain away what he called implausibilities. He said, neither Giuseppe Saputo, aged 75 but in good health, nor the ubiquitous Joe Borsellino, nor the owners of B&T Cheese, nor Ivano Scatolin, the brother-in-law associated with Proditz Cayette, were produced to clarify or explain away the troubling inferences to be drawn from the briefcase papers, or the Bonanno trash, or the unusual B&T Cheese transaction. The unusual B&T Cheese transaction is perhaps the most interesting story unveiled in the trash notes. It explains why you keep hearing about organized crime, but you never see it. Several times a year, a note from Bonanno's trash would read liquido, that means cash, from Montreal. Sometimes there would be a phone number, Borsellino's, or an amount, $100,000. What happened following one of those requests involved 3 cheese companies, and it took 5 law enforcement agencies and Tom Fant, the CPA who worked for the state of New York, to sort it all out.
Yes, a related company in Canada, Produits Cayette, distributes Saputo cheese in the United States. One of the distributors is B&T Cheese Company in Pennsylvania.
According to Judge Charles Breitel, B&T Cheese usually paid Proditz Cayette by check. Once, however, B&T stopped payment on a $51,000 check and withdrew $51,000 in cash from its local bank. The next day, there's a record that B&T Cheese paid somebody's expenses for a trip to New York.
And then we got word of a big flight out of New York. So now we knew that there was going to be a movement. We didn't know what we had yet. We knew who was involved, Aunt Marion. We knew Tucson was involved. That was the destination.
That was a note that was gathered on the 28th of November of 1977, and it shows specific directions on how to get to the airport and how to carry the package.
And we came up with Aunt Marion going out to the airport with 2 tremendous suitcases. And we noticed Aunt Marion getting on a plane, notified Tucson, and then at that point we stepped back.
We then watched Aunt Marion get off of the plane in Tucson and bring her luggage and her package to Joseph Bonanno.
And as it turns out, that suitcase, well, the following day in the trash, they discovered wrappers, money wrappers. And these money wrappers were traced back to a bank in Pennsylvania. Now, the money wrappers, they could trace a little further to indicate that the money was deposited by B&T Cheese Company.
Authorities in Pennsylvania were able to interview the employees whose initials were on the wrapper, and they were able to say, yes, we remember a specific time when Saputo Cheese Company came in and withdrew $51,000. And it occurred through B&T Cheese in Pennsylvania. Look at this transaction all by itself and think to yourself, what's happened? What happened was that this money was ordered by Joseph Bonanno of the Saputo Cheese Company. That's not normal business activity. It's not a normal bank-to-bank transfer like would usually occur. That can't be a legitimate way of operating. And when you think about it and when you try and figure out what it is that's happening here, you're seeing that there are layers and layers and layers of structure that have been given to these kinds of fund transfers that keep people from seeing where the legitimate and where the illegitimate ends.
They're working together for one objective, to make money, and that's the whole objective of Cosa Nostra, make money.
Every dollar that a consumer spends, about 4 cents of it is diverted into some criminal, organized crime takeoff.
Judge Breitel's opinion illustrated how money from one cheese company had been diverted. But when the Pennsylvania Crime Commission made its report, it included this chart that linked Bonanno to a score of cheese companies. First is the Colorado Cheese Company, formed by Bonanno in the 40s. In 1953, it was charged with fraud against the government. The Catroni crime family in Montreal worked closely with Bonanno's underboss, Carmen Galente. Members of the Catroni family also met with Bill Bonanno in the 60s. The Crime Commission shows Vincent Catroni is the owner of Reggio Foods. Reggio was one of the suppliers for Saputo cheese. And that's the company Judge Charles Breitel ruled had an ongoing relationship with Joe Bonanno. B&T Cheese Company in Pennsylvania is one of Saputo's 3 distributors in the United States. It's the one Breitel said was involved in the $51,000 payment that came through Proditz Cayette. The Falcone brothers, Joseph and Matteo, established a number of cheese companies that went bankrupt, owing dairy farmers thousands of dollars. In Alburg, Vermont, Joseph Falcone and his office manager were convicted for bankruptcy fraud after running up bills of $500,000. Joseph Falcone attended the Appalachian meeting with Joe Bonanno. In 1954, the Falcones incorporated Gourmet Cheese of Wisconsin. Gourmet became a wholly owned subsidiary of Grande Cheese. Grande is the granddaddy of all Bonanno's cheese interests. 150 of its 2,000 shares were in his wife's name, Faye Bonanno. In the 50s, John DeBella became one of the officers of Grande Cheese. DeBella was the one who wrote the letter introducing Bonanno to the Saputos in the 60s. F&A Cheese in Michigan is owned by DeBella's nephews, Frank and Angelo Terranova. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission says it was a loan from their uncle John DeBella that allowed them to start the business. Roma Foods is Grande's distributor in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and the Crime Commission says Roma uses Salvatore Proface as a consultant and an enforcer. Salvatore's sister, Rosalie, married Bill Bonanno. Another of the former officers of Grande Cheese is Alfonso Caruso. Caruso was president of Grande Cheese in 1965. He was also listed as president of Gourmet Cheese, the business that was established by the Falcones, and of Cloverdale Dairy, another business established by the Falcones. Now Alfonso Caruso is in Arizona. He is the president of Star Cheese in Phoenix. In Joe Bonanno's trash were notes that referred to an Al Caruso, notes that said, "Call Al Caruso, thank him, call Caruso Santone." The Santones are Jack and Joe Santone. They owned a business in Phoenix called Mercury Sales. Mercury Sales was the wholesale outlet for F&A Cheese, the company owned by Frank and Angelo Terranova. F&A Cheese eventually bought out Mercury Sales. The Santones signed an agreement with the Terranovas that they wouldn't compete in the cheese business in Phoenix for 5 years. The Santones' name turned up often in the trash notes of Joe Bonanno, and there was one note that referred to the Terranovas. The Santones are back in business selling cheese under a new name, Santone Grocery. The task of charting the network of influence that began with the Colorado Cheese Company 40 years ago seems endless. The business partnerships that form and reform, the ties of kinship and of marriage, the web of favors that are given and received, they all weave a network of powerful influence. And the strong threads that run through that fabric all seem to end in the hands of Joe Bonanno. The story of Joe Bonanno ends where it began, in the notes from the trash. Bonanno's sons owned several businesses in California. A grand jury thought those businesses were being used to launder money and defraud creditors. When the jury asked Joe Bonanno Sr. if he knew anything about Kachina Enterprises, one of his son's businesses, he He said simply, "I am not the custodian of the records."
On the trash day of March 16th, which was a Friday, we made a pickup and found a promissory note that had been shred into 1,000 pieces. And it was a promissory note to Joseph Bonanno from the business of Kachina Enterprises.
2 days later, 10 strike force and FBI agents appeared at Bonanno's door with a search warrant in hand. Eamon was assigned to search the basement.
Within minutes of arriving in the basement, we found documentation and evidence that was pertinent to the grand jury proceedings over in California, specifically a couple of boxes and a couple of envelopes of records relating to business transactions, relating to tax matters, and that kind of thing. We then went to his desk and looked in his desk and found thousands of pieces of paper, literally several years worth of documentation in the desk itself. We saw where he had been writing his notes and from what kinds of pads and the same kinds of pens we had seen. So it was clear to us that that was, in fact, where he'd been writing the notes all of these years.
Eamon was certain there was a secret room in the basement, and so he checked behind some shelves filled with olive oil and tomato paste.
We removed some cans, knocked on a wooden panel that was down on the lower portion of that false wall, and a small door swung in to a little room, 3 by 4 by 8 feet, which was filled full of boxes and bags, and they were filled full of documents. There was also a couple of tool chests that had $40,000 of machine-stacked cash in it, $100 bills. There were several guns, there were some jewelry, and some fur coats. Inside one athletic bag, we found magazines, articles, and documents that related to Joe himself, old magazines that he had saved. On top of that was a stack of papers, perhaps 2.5, 3 inches, several hundred pages of different kinds of paper, handwritten by Joe, different kinds of ink, which obviously spanned over a period of years because of the age of the paper. And those papers were a chronicle of Joe's life that laid out what he had done from the time that he lived as a small boy in Sicily up until sometime in the late 60s. And it chronologically explained a good deal of what the mafia did, what the mafia was about, how the modern mafia in the United States came to be, and what his role was in the mafia. And he specifically explained his leadership role and where he was for a period of years and what his domain was.
6 hours later, agents left with boxes of documents relating to various crimes. But it still wasn't over, because Bonanno hadn't been told that the search warrant was based on the notes from his garbage. And so, on the day of the next trash pickup following the raid, the cans were stuffed with 1,200 pages of documents and notes. That was it. The trash pickup had come to an end for the strike force and for Bonanno. 1 year later, in the summer of 1980, Joe Bonanno was convicted of a conspiracy to obstruct justice based on the notes. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. That's the maximum allowed for that crime. And it is the first time that Joe Bonanno has been sentenced to jail. But he's not in jail. Joe Bonanno appealed his sentence. The story of Joe Bonanno makes fascinating telling. But what does it mean? It means that you and I pay more for cheese and for fish and for products that are shipped in trucks because organized crime takes a cut and adds to the price. It means that we pay taxes we need not pay because organized crime doesn't pay its share.
It's estimated by the Justice Department somewhere between $65 and $100 billion a year is untaxed, unregulated. So if you put a tax on that, even after, if it were legitimate expenses were deducted, you're talking about billions of dollars lost.
Put another way, you could subtract 20% from your tax bill if organized criminals paid theirs. Given the Internal Revenue Service's fascination with the deductions on your tax return, one would expect it to eagerly seize this opportunity to recover millions, but it hasn't. The IRS was the agency that finally put Al Capone in jail. It was for tax evasion. But ever since Watergate and the rumors of enemies lists, the IRS has been super careful not to let its role as tax collector be confused with the role of a policeman. For example, it has never asked to see the notes collected from Bonanno's trash, even though many of them outline Bonanno's plans to manipulate money for tax purposes.
I think the Internal Revenue Service has really dropped the ball. It's a good agency, competent, qualified people, but we don't get the support, law enforcement doesn't, that it ought to.
That means that if the FBI needed the IRS to help trace the influence of organized crime in business, the IRS wouldn't cooperate. The law wouldn't even allow it to. Would you consider the FBI a cooperative agency? That you cooperate with local law enforcement?
Most definitely. Oh, no, the FBI, and God bless them, it's a good agency. They have great talented people, and they've done some good things on organized crime, but generally they will not cooperate with local law enforcement. And so if they get information about organized crime, it never comes back to be shared with the local people, even if it ends up being an Arizona case.
Organized criminals have made cooperation into a fine art. But the law enforcement officials that fight organized crime don't even share information routinely. In fact, they're reluctant to share it even when they're specifically requested to do so. So what do we do? Well, a thorough, ongoing investigation would help. There hasn't been one since Valachi, and a lot has happened since then. And a demand from the White House that agencies begin cooperating would help enormously. They do it in Canada. Judge Dion told us that during his crime probe, a tax official was assigned to the crime probe office, not to reveal tax records, but to help develop a list of questions that the crime probe officers could use in their hearings. What would help most is a permanent crime commission with some clout from the White House, and Senator DeConcini has already made the plans.
Create a cabinet-level enforcement officer, not a new bureaucracy or a new cabinet ministry, but someone who would have the same cabinet levels appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, who would have the authority to task, to require resources from any law enforcement agency to work together. And only the President could veto that person's order. And that's what I think we need.
We certainly need something. Most of the leads that were collected in the notes remain locked away in police files. The law enforcement officials are taking pot shots at each other. And you're still paying 4 cents on every dollar to organized crime. And Joe Bonanno is doing what he's been doing for 40 years. He's retired.